I was thinking this morning, it won't be much longer and we won't be having hymn books. Many churches have already taken them out because we have the electronic help to help us. Well, let me read this passage here. It's from Genesis chapter 50, 15 through 21. Let me give you the setting. Joseph's father, Jacob, has died. And his brothers, knowing how cruelly they treated him, are afraid that he now, in turn, will treat them cruelly. So here his words. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I asked you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants, of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. I'll come back more to Joseph in a few minutes. Abraham Lincoln, in spite of the fact of having only 1 year of formal education, became our 16th president and gave his famous Emancipation Proclamation that freed 4 million people that had been enslaved. Thomas Edison, in spite of his near deafness, and his deafness, as best I can understand, came from the time when he was working for a railroad and the conductor got angry with him and boxed both of his ears and left him almost completely deaf. But in spite of that, he gave us more patents than anyone else in history. He gave us over 1,100 patents of inventions that he made in his lifetime. And then, as we look at the Bible characters, Abraham was a liar. How many of you knew Abraham was a liar? May I see your hands? Oh, well, a few of you did. Good. And like me, nobody had to teach him how to lie. Anybody who doesn't believe in sin needs to get children who are 2 or 3 years old and give them one toy and see what happens. We are by nature sinful. That is who we are. And so, what was his lie? He was going into Egypt. Ladies, listen now, because you get concerned about yourself as you age. Anybody remember how old his wife was when they went to Egypt? 65 years old. And he said, "You are a beautiful woman." So beautiful that when we get into Egypt, they're going to tell Pharaoh about you, and I want you to tell them that you're my sister. Well, it was a half-truth. They both had the same father, but they had different mothers, and so she agreed to do it. And sure enough, they got into Egypt, and word quickly got to the Pharaoh, "Beautiful woman here." And ladies, it wasn't long until she went to his harem. And though the Bible doesn't tell us, we know that by being in his harem because of her beauty, she was in bed with someone other than her husband that night. Now think of it. We call this man the friend of God. But he was a liar. And if the friend of God is capable of that kind of sin, what are you and I capable of doing? And then we come to Noah, a man who found favor in God's sight. And God spared only him and his family and destroyed all the rest. And then sadly, he got drunk. And you know the rest of the story. But in spite of that, he was the man who was declared so righteous in God's sight that he saved just him and his family. Now, why did he do this after they're being saved? Because you see, the flood didn't take away their sinful nature. The biggest shock I had when I came to Richmond to be pastor of the Northside Baptist Church, it was almost 2 years before I found anybody in Richmond who believed they were a sinner. You see, I had served my mountain churches, and though many of the people didn't come to the worship service, they knew the Bible. And they knew what you were supposed to do, and they knew what you were not supposed to do. And the mountain men, particularly in western North Carolina, they wanted God to do what he had done for the Apostle Paul. They wanted a light to shine. They wanted to drop to their knees, and they wanted to hear a voice from heaven. And you know what I said to those men? God has said all he intends to say. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And then we come to Moses, the man who was called by God, the meekest man who ever lived. But you are aware of the fact that Moses murdered a man, are you not? Had to flee for his life. In spite of that, God used him. And then we come to Rahab, the prostitute. And now many people want to ignore what the Bible says. And notice this, they said, well, don't call her a prostitute, call her an innkeeper. Well, the Bible calls her a prostitute. And where the Bible speaks, I'm going to speak. And where the Bible is silent, I'm going to be silent. But they got there and they found out, these spies who had been sent into the land, that Rahab and all the others had been trembling with fear because they knew how God had opened the Red Sea and how he was going to bless them. And then I think about David, the man after God's own heart. And I tremble when I come to that part in the Old Testament where it says that David slept late one day, sent his troops off to war, didn't go with him as he should have, lived in the tallest house, looked out on the and ladies, guess what he saw? He saw Bathsheba bathing. Now, the women waited until all the men were gone because you didn't have much privacy back at that time. And the problem wasn't with his first look. Let me tell you, ladies, something in case you don't know it. We men are designed to love with our eyes. You women are designed to love with your ears. And I try every day before the day is over to ask my wife, did I tell you today that I love you? We've been married 61 years, put the engagement ring on her when she was 16, married her when she was 18. The only time that success comes before work is in the dictionary. Marriage is something you have to work at. And the reason we're having so much trouble with marriage in our country today and that so many marriages are falling apart is people have forgotten what marriage is all about. And then we come to the man we know, Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who went out, who voted for Christians to be killed, who did all kinds of brutal things against them. And the day came, when I go back to that reference I made about the mountain men, when there was that blinding light and that voice from heaven that said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? You see, to persecute the church of Jesus Christ is to persecute you and me. And you know the thrilling story of how he was changed. And we have 13 books in our New Testament because of him. In spite of all that was going on in the lives of these different people I've named, some biblical, some historical, God was at work. And then we think about our Lord Jesus Christ himself. At the age of 33, he birthed his church, changed more lives, blessed more people than anyone else in time or eternity. And he is still at work today. No wonder he's called the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now, in spite of, would not be a bad epitaph to have on our tomb. And that's why we're going to take a few minutes and look at Joseph. He was a pampered son. You can take the letter P and very easily remember the life of Joseph. He was a pampered son. Let's see, any of you here, let's start back here at the choir, any of you think that a sibling, if you had a sibling, was favored by your parents more? That happened? Anybody back here? See a few hands. Let's go over on this side. Anybody over on this side feel, okay, got some hands over here. How about over here? Okay. Well, he was the pampered son. And guess what? His brothers did not like it. And so he soon found himself in trouble. And you remember what they did when he came to talk with them? They threw him into a pit. He was 17 years old when they threw him into that pit. Now, one brother planned to come back and rescue him, but before he could get back, the other brothers sold him off into slavery, and then he found himself in Potiphar's house. And while in Potiphar's house, Potiphar soon discovered that though he didn't know who God was, that there was something different about this man, and so he turned everything over to Potiphar. And one day while he was at work in the house, all alone, Mrs. Potiphar came in. And she invited him into bed. And he said to her, "How could I commit such a sin against you and against my God?" So she waited another time, and they were alone. And he did what we all must do when faced with temptation. He ran. But she grabbed his coat, and they came home. And she said to her husband, "Look what this man did to me." Now, stay with me. He didn't kill him. He put him into prison. Because I think he knew something about his wife and the kind of woman she was. So he goes in prison. And in prison, there are some people there. They're in trouble too. One was a servant, one was a baker. They had both fallen into disfavor with the Pharaoh, and they had dreams, and they found out that Joseph could interpret dreams, and he interpreted their dreams for them, and he interpreted them correctly. The baker was put to death, and the man who was the one who always had to taste the wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned, the cupbearer, he was set free. 2 years pass, and finally the king has a dream, and nobody can interpret the dream for him, and then the cupbearer goes to the king and says, "I made a promise and I didn't keep it." By the way, let me see back here again. Any of you ever made promises you didn't keep? Okay, getting a much better response here. How about over here? Any of you? Okay, the hands went up real quick. Let me try on this side. Okay. Let me tell you with sadness, those of you who are still young fathers, I made a lot of promises I didn't keep. My closing years in Gloucester County, I drove 25,000 miles a year. I was gone day and night. Marriages being split apart, sad things happening. My wife and children sometimes wondered if they had a daddy. God doesn't intend us to live that way. And I made promises to my kids I didn't keep. Some I kept, but some I didn't. I hope you're better at keeping promises than I was. But he remembers, and so they bring him out, and he interprets the dream. The dream that the king had was he saw 7 lean cows, and he also saw the fields where everything in them were dying, and he interpreted for the king, and he said there's going to be 7 years of prosperity and then 7 years of famine. And so he made Joseph what we would call today the premier, overall, premier sound right? Premier overall, okay? And then we find out his age. He was now 30 years old. Thrown in the pit at the age of 17. Finally, no longer a slave at the age of 30. How many years is that? 13? What's going on in those time right there when you're 17, 18, 19, 20? What's going on then to both men and women? Maturity. I only took one course in adolescence in college. I never will forget what the professor said. He said, adolescence is the essence of being addled. And boy, what a difficult time it is. But where was he? He was a prisoner, suffering unbelievably. I helped a young lady when I was at Northside, mature now, school teacher. She had the same problem I have. I was here with you over 4 years. How many of you know I have a temper? Okay. How about over here? Well, I must have done a better job hiding it than I thought I did. You take the word anger and you put the letter D in front of it, it spells danger. The Bible says, be angry, but do not sin. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, or give place to the devil. So anger is a legitimate emotion. We just have to remember to be angry at the right time, in the right way, with the right person. Most couples that I know about, the conversations that I've been in over the years, they started out disagreeing over something very simply, and then they immediately moved from what I call tit to tat. They felt attacked, and they dealt differently with that. So he had suffered all those years, and we saw in our passage that we read earlier how that the brothers were thought now that he's going to come and pour out his vengeance upon us. And you know, it broke his heart. And he had to assure them that he forgave them. I met a man many years ago. He had been in the Korean War. I was not sent to Korea, though I was in there. In the British Army, I found out that if you are a musician, you can go in as early as the age of 13. And he had been captured and spent 3 years in a North Korean prison camp. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a teenager and be in prison all those years? Sometimes we read the Bible, but we don't think about what we're being told. And so he suffered all of that. So in spite of all of these things, he learned some lessons. This is Betty and her family slipping away. They said they'd be doing that. They're here to go greet the others that'll be staying. She's one of Mary's daughters. Here are the lessons that I see in his life. He learned in all of these situations how to trust God, because over and over again it says in the closing passages, and God was with him. I have times when I feel like God is not with me, but I know he is. And you do too. That's the first lesson we learn from him. Here's the second one. He was a man of integrity. No matter what the temptation was, he was going to be true to God, and he was going to be true to himself. Thirdly, he was a man of patience. For 17 years, God was with him, and he just suffered all kinds of things. You know, he wasn't in a hotel. He was in a prison. And he was suffering all that go in the prison house. And then he was a man of faithfulness, faithful to the end. You know, you will not find one single bad word ever said about Joseph. If I were looking to the closest to Jesus in the Bible, I'd pick Joseph. Heard a lot about Daniel growing up as a child. But Joseph is the one I picked, faithful to the end. Another lesson I see in him is his humility. Read once about a church that each year they recognize somebody as the most humble person in that church. And this man got the pen and water ran for it. Said, I am the most humble man in this church. How long do you think he stayed humble after he got that? The word humility means to get down on the ground and bow down. That's what humility involves. And then the last thing I've got down here for us is he had no bitterness. His brothers just knew that now that he had time, he was just going to zack them. And you know what that did to him? That broke his heart. And he assured them that God had forgiven them. Now, we're told, as we move toward the end of the chapter that we read, chapter 50, I want to pick up where I left off. It's verse 22, that he stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived to be 110 years old. He saw the third generation of Ephraim's children and the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh. They were placed on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath to him. God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Isn't it fascinating that the Bible opens with God creating a beautiful garden and closes with a coffin? But the man in that coffin believed God's promises, never stopped believing them. In spite of all the things that happened to him, he remained faithful. And so we find out, and let me get my reference here, that we come to the book of Joshua, chapter 24, and verse 32, and give me a moment to get there, and we will see what happened to those bones. I'm turning slowly, so just stay with me. 24:32. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua, and the elders who outlived him, who had experienced everything the Lord had done for, and Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the tract of land Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. An ancient writer said this, that when they left Egypt, they took away all the things that God told them to. He said, after I send these plagues, they'll just give you whatever you want. But you know the most important thing they took away was Joseph's bones. He had promised them that the God who has been faithful to me is going to be faithful to you. Now, I don't know where you are in your life today, but in spite of is a good reference point for us. And what we do with that in spite of is going to determine our future and whether or not we're going to spend eternity in heaven.